Hey guys, it's Dr. Hayes, and this is the video that's going to be about Louisa May Alcott, since we're reading Little Women for the next couple of weeks. And so this is a little background video about her and her family and some of the autobiographical details that went into writing Little Women, and just a little bit of the scenes from Little Women that came from her life. And next week we will talk more about historical context and some of the cultural context about being a woman, young woman and a girl in America during the Civil War era, which is when this came out, and how that young girl would have grown up and what the different options are. And in Little Women, we have four young women who are all very different, and so we get to see a few different choices that young girls had as far as the path for growing up. So we'll talk more about that in next week's video. This one's going to be about Louisa May Alcott. This that I'm recording now is just an intro because I recorded a video about Louisa May Alcott last semester for a different class, and so I'm going to cut to myself here in just a second, and that's the one that you'll be, so I'll switch shirts and switch lightings and everything, but I've cut a piece out of that video that was about other things too. So you're about to hear from me about Louisa May Alcott, and then I'll come back at the end just to kind of wrap things up. Okay, bye! Let's move on to Louisa May Alcott. I know a lot more about her. I've been sort of obsessed with her for like my whole life. But, let me see, I think I want to... Is this the screen I want to go to? Yeah. So I thought I would tell you a little bit about the Alcotts themselves, and because you can't really talk about Louisa May Alcott without talking about her parents and her family, because especially since Little Women was so autobiographical. It wasn't straight up autobiography, but a lot of the elements in it and the ways the characters are created was definitely autobiographical. So, Louisa is, just like in Little Women, she's one of four girls. She has an older sister named Anna, who is represented as Meg in the story. She's the second oldest, just like in the story. Then she has Lizzie, who's the third, who's represented as Beth in Little Women. And then there's May, who is the youngest sister, who is Amy. Which, Amy, if you notice, is the letters of May switched around. If you switch A and M, you get Amy, right? I assume that was on purpose, but she didn't do that with... I mean, Lizzie is like short for Elizabeth. I think her full name was Elizabeth, and so Beth is her name. I'm not sure about Anna. I don't know how they changed her to Meg. I don't know why she changed her to Meg and herself to Joe. Maybe Joe and Lou are similar boys' names. But anyway, she definitely represented her family in Little Women, and her parents. They look really severe in their portraits, but that's just kind of how the style of photography at the time. So I need to tell you a little bit about Bronson Alcott and Abigail Alcott. She went by Abba. Abigail went by Abba. So most of you guys in this class are education majors, and so you will probably study Bronson Alcott at some point. Bronson Alcott is a big influential name in the sort of early history of education in America. I didn't mention him in our last lecture about education in class because I knew we were going to talk about him during this. So Bronson Alcott basically invented what is called child-centered learning, which is kind of how all early childhood education is modeled today. Like the child-centered, like learning styles and lessons catered to the way a child's mind works rather than the way an adult's mind works. You know, we talked about education for the longest time was just, here, memorize these things. Memorize the letters, then memorize the words. Then you move up and you memorize little sentences, and then you memorize the poems. And it was a lot of just memorization, and then eventually you got into translation, where you'd be given a passage in some other language and you'd have to translate it into English. And so that's what a lot of education consisted of. Well, Bronson Alcott was very, very interested in development, like especially childhood development. He was one of the key figures in the Transcendentalist movement. So if you studied at all American history in school and you learned about the Transcendentalists, the big names in Transcendentalism were Emerson and Thoreau. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, literary giants in American history. They ran the sort of Transcendentalist movement. Well, Bronson Alcott was very close friends with both of them, much more so with Emerson. Emerson was like a very close friend. Like Louisa and the girls considered Ralph Waldo Emerson to be like their uncle, and he helped them out a lot of times when they were in financial trouble and mentored them. And so their family was very much involved in the Transcendentalist movement, which the goal of that movement was self-reflection, examine yourself, look for ways to improve. People at the time thought it was very, hippy-dippy and, oh gosh, just a lot of like emphasis on self-improvement and introspection and things like that. But what came out of that was a lot of experimental theories about education and childhood development. So when the oldest daughter Anna was born, he kept a very detailed journal log of her behaviors and her development, and he would do experiments on her, not like creepy, but he would, like, when she was little, he would, boo, and then write down what her reaction was, right? And I mean, it was kind of like cruel, but like in a not, long-term harmful way. But he made a very detailed log and observations about her development. It was the first of its kind of anything like that. Any sort of observational data about a child's development. It was the first thing like that. And so, some of the result of a lot of his theories and a lot of his interest in childhood development turned into him wanting to be an educator. So he opened a school. The Alcotts were from Boston originally. They grew up in Boston, and a lot of their a lot of Louisa's young life was in Boston, and so he ran a school called the Temple School. It was in the top floor of a Masonic temple, and it was really experimental for the time, because these are all going to be things you recognize. He decorated the school like with things that, like, images that children would like. Like he had a globe and he had maps and he had like pictures of art and he had some sculpture and things. Like he had visually interesting things decorating the room. Imagine that. He had pretty specific opinions about how the desks should be organized to promote interaction and involvement in the learning process. So he had all of these like he experimented with the configuration of the desks in the room. I don't know if I could go on record saying he invented this, but he probably invented it in the context of school. But he pretty much invented the concept of story time, using story time in school. And so he would read aloud, like he as the teacher would read aloud, not for the students to recite back to him as like a lesson, but just read to them from books as an entertainment, right? As something he recognized the value of children being read aloud to. He also had very sort of wildly progressive views on discipline in school. He was very much against physical punishment, which Alcott represents and depicts in Little Women when Amy gets struck, at school for having the limes. So he was very much against physical, like corporal punishment in school. He had other creative ways. Like one of his most severe punishments that he used in school was that a child who was misbehaving had to miss out on story time. And so he would make them sit, out with his secretary like downstairs, and they couldn't participate in story time, and that was like the harshest, cruelest punishment, and nobody would act up because they didn't want to be punished. So he used more of a rewards and consequences system that was not physical. All of these things, if you have gone through school or if you're studying school, you're like, yeah, you're describing school. Yes, he was, so he was very influential in the early development of what a child-centered classroom looks like and is like. And he was very close collaborators with the woman, I forget her name, who established the first kindergarten in the United States. I think she was a secretary for a time, and then she developed the very first ever kindergarten. His school didn't last a super long time. It was successful for a while, but then he ended up having to shut it down for a couple reasons. One is he began to include sex education as part of the curriculum because he felt like it was important for young people to understand the health of their bodies and understand how their bodies work. And he considered it to be science just like anything else. So he included sex ed as part of the curriculum. And he also admitted a black girl as a student, which... at the time, this was in the 1840s, I think. So it would have been before the emancipation. Now, they were in the North. They were in Boston. So it would, there were plenty of free black people up there. But it was still pretty controversial for him to integrate his school in that way, to have a black student and a girl as a student. And so the school kind of lost popularity and had to shut down after that. But he still continued his research, and he published books about education and everything. There was a time when they did it. He and his whole family, they founded and participated in an experimental community. When they moved out into the country, they bought an orchard and lived out there with a bunch of other families. And now we would call it a commune. They founded a commune called Fruitlands, and I mean they only stayed for like a year. They didn't have hardly any money, and they just weren't cut out for it. And so and a lot of the people they had recruited to join the commune ended up leaving because it wasn't what they thought it was going to be. And so that didn't last very long, but it was just kind of indicative of this experimental, progressive ideas that Louisa May Alcott was raised with. I need to tell you a little bit about Abba. She is boss, mainly because Marmee in Little Women is such a boss, awesome character that you need to sort of know that Abigail, she looks scary as hell in that picture of her. There aren't really any good pictures, but I think that's just the style of photography at the time. But she was sort of famous in their community. I should mention, after the school failed, they eventually moved to Concord, Massachusetts, and that's where they sort of settled, was in Concord, Massachusetts. When Louisa, they were much older, they moved to Concord, Massachusetts, and that's where they sort of were known for being in that community, and that's where she sort of lived out the rest of her life. Let me move to this. This was their house, Orchard House. It's still there. You can go to it. I think some of the most recent film that came out was actually, the exteriors were filmed there. But it's set up inside as like a museum. Like you can go visit it. Orchard House. And see that you can kind of see right here, that's a portrait of Alcott when she's a little bit older. Yeah, so that's once she became a famous author, she had this sort of a famous portrait she had made when she was older. But anyway, so they moved to Concord and they lived in this orchard house. And so later in life, Abba, Alcott's mom, Abba became, I'm looking for my cursor. She became very active in the Concord public community, just like Marmee in Little Women. Abba, she is pretty much sort of credited as being the first social worker. Like, she opened up a like a halfway house for women where she taught them skills. She had sewing classes and other kinds of domestic classes where lower class women could come in and learn a skill that they could use to support themselves. Usually it was sewing and things like that, but there were other things. And they did sort of like trainings and counseling, and they had like clothing that would be donated. So it was basically she was the first social worker. And she would have women come there, and she would teach them how to carry themselves and how to give them a good outfit to wear, and then they could go get themselves a job and they would learn a skill. And so Bronson gets a lot of the attention in the educational world, but Abigail Alcott was amazing. She was just this amazing humanitarian and worker, and changed countless women's lives. And so Louisa May Alcott sort of passed that on to the Marmee character. Marmee is probably a romanticized, nostalgic representation of Abba Alcott. I mean, because Marmee, a lot of people criticize Little Women because Marmee is just too good. Like, she's just flawless, right? She's just too good. She's never angry. She always knows the right thing to say. She gives the perfect gifts at the exact right time, and she's so selfless and gives. So Marmee's characterization in the book, I'm gonna blow myself back up. Marmee's characterization in the book is probably a little bit unrealistic, but Abba was amazing, right? She was amazing. So I don't want to downplay that. Alcott, just a little bit of about her. So she never married. That's one major difference between her and Jo, her character in Little Women, is that she Alcott herself never married. There's speculation because she had a really, really, really good woman friend who they did everything, and they traveled together and stuff like that. So there's some speculation that she was a lesbian, but didn't have that as an option in her life back then. She couldn't have lived as a lesbian. So, she just didn't, get married at all. But she was independently wealthy, so she didn't have to. She, became a successful author. So she taught, she worked as a teacher, and she worked as a governess where Anna, her older sister, just like Meg, worked as a governess. Jo worked as, Jo, not in the novel did, but Louisa worked also as a governess and as a teacher, just like Jo did for a little bit. And she ran the house and taught her younger sisters while Anna went out and worked and got money for the house. That was all real, just from her real life. During the Civil War, Louisa went and worked as a nurse in a Washington hospital, and she wrote about it. And she has a collection of essays called Hospital Sketches, and she wrote about some of her experiences working in the hospital during the Civil War in Washington, and the experiencing the wounded men and sort of the trauma of that. It really affected her the rest of her life. She actually ended up contracting typhoid and was sent home because she contracted typhoid, and the treatments for her typhoid actually gave her mercury poisoning. And so that she was basically unwell the rest of her whole life as an adult. She wasn't a full-on invalid, but she just was sort of sickly and unwell for the rest of her life because of the mercury poisoning and the typhoid she encountered during that. So after she got back from that, she started editing a children's magazine. And one of the editors at the publishing company is like, you should write a girl's book, a book for girls, like what we're talking about. Publishers were even saying, we want a girl's book, right? And so she had already been writing. She'd wrote Hospital Sketches. Before that, she had been publishing stories just like Jo does in Little Women. She published stories under a male pseudonym. She had it was like H.K. Bernard or something. Bernard was was her pen name, and it was a masculine name. And so she had a bunch of like ghost stories and sort of adventure stories and things that she would publish under a male pseudonym. But she had started publishing some things under her name. She had one called Flowers in the Attic. That was the first thing she published under her name. And so she decided to write Little Women, which was sort of an account of very loose autobiographical account. And so Little Women, it came out in the 1860s, but it came out in 2 parts. So originally, Little Women was published, like Little Women was just the first half. If you're familiar with the story at all, there is a point in the middle of the story where several years passed. Several years passed. There's a huge jump in time. Now, Little Women is published as all one book. When it's adapted into movies, it's all one story, the whole thing, and it ends with her marrying Professor Bear, and they decide they're going to open up a school with Aunt March's old house. Well, that was the sequel. Originally, Little Women was published, it was just their childhood. Well, it was massively popular, and she had all these fans, and she had little girls, coming to visit her at her house, and like she became a celebrity as well, and she, like, her publishers were clamoring for a sequel, clamoring for her to finish and do, they wanted more from the March girls, right? They wanted more, and part of that pressure was, who is Jo gonna marry? Jo's gotta marry Laurie. Jo's gotta, everybody just assumed they were gonna get married. And so but she didn't, her intention was to keep Jo an old maid. Like, Jo was very much like herself, had no interest in boys, no interest in, running a home. She wanted to write and be educated and be wild and independent, right? That's what Jo wanted. And so modern feminist readers sometimes see Jo's fate as a tragedy, that she ended up Louisa ended up marrying off her one true character that could have been different, who could have not had the happily ever after ending that every girl was expected to have. But at the time, for a girl's book, the main girl, the expectation was that the end of her story, the path she was on, would lead to marriage. That was the expectation. She was trying to make a good match. Everything she was doing was leading up to that. So it would not have been seemly for Jo to have remained unmarried. So the way that Alcott chose to do it was sort of her little rebellious way. So she made Laurie be with Amy instead. And she gave Jo an older German professor as her husband, which, when you think about it, it's a perfect match. So I do want to talk about the Little Women on the surface is very much a girl's book. Like, all of the adventure and drama is girl stuff. Like, what are they going to have to eat, and cooking, cooking tragedies and burning of their hair before a party, and not having a good dress and losing a glove, and who's going to be marrying whom, and all this stuff. So it is very much a girl's book as far as that goes. But Alcott, she knew what she was doing. She subverted a lot of expected gender norms in this book. She had her main girl character be a tomboy, who dreaded, girl things. She had her main boy character be feminine. So the two main characters in this book, Jo and Laurie, are gender swapped. They are, Jo wishes, her impulse is toward masculine things. Like, her impulse is toward going to school and she, blast these wretched skirts. She doesn't want to dress like a girl. And there's many times she talks about feeling uncomfortable in her body and feeling like she's trapped in this girl body when she was destined to be a boy. She just knows it, right? Nowadays, if Joe and maybe even Alcott herself, if they were born now, they would probably become transgender. Just real talk. They probably would, because the way Joe talks about herself, and it's not just, I don't like girly stuff. It's deep. It is, I feel trapped in this dreaded girl's body, right? I feel trapped in this girl's life. I feel trapped in this girl's clothes. I feel trapped in this girl's existence. She goes, I just know I was meant to be a boy. There was some mistake. Like she says that in the book. So nowadays, it's very possible that Joe and maybe Alcott would have been transgender if that had been an option. That is not canon. That is not something that, she'd do. And that's just my suspicion. Laurie is depicted as a very feminine boy. And man, he's depicted with sort of a delicate physique. He has long, slender fingers. He's a musician. Like he plays the piano and composes music. His uncle and his family want him to go into business, but he just wants to play music and appreciate art. And all of his friends are girls. He hangs out with girls all day and plays and does their plays with them and make believe. And so he's like now he would be the gay friend, right? He would be like the gay friend in a group of girls. So you have these two main characters who have gender swapped their traditional roles. But the tragedy is that at the time that they existed and the time that Alcott was living, that was not an option. You could not swap your gender roles. It was okay for a girl to be a tomboy as long as she grew out of it and got back on track into the marriage path. It was okay for a young boy to be maybe a little bit more feminine in youth, but as long as he sort of like bloomed and toughened up and was sent off to school and kind of was toughened up and became a man eventually. And so they're both of these characters are on a path in youth that they cannot walk down. And so, I think Alcott sort of is threading a needle there with trying to subvert gender roles that she probably feel trapped by herself, while also adhering to the cultural and social expectations of the time. Again, I've gotten kind of deep about this book, but there are a lot of very lighthearted and endearing moments. One of the ones is where they play Pilgrim's Progress. You've read the chapbook of Pilgrim's Progress in this class, and so I definitely excerpted the scene where they play Pilgrim's Progress so that you could see how much longevity. Pilgrim's Progress came out in the late 1600s. This is the late or mid to late 1800s. So 200 years later, it is still sort of a staple of, the childhood experience of, having Pilgrim's Progress be such a big part, of your life. So I wanted to show you that part too. And there's definitely endearing moments, but for me, I wanted to contrast Little Women against Tom Sawyer, because Tom Sawyer is definitely the quintessential boys book, but it definitely has some sort of heavy moments in it, some real stakes and sort of introspection. Little Women seems like the quintessential girls book on the surface, and all of the lighthearted, so you can definitely read it that way, but it definitely has some deeper things it's saying about the expectations of gender and womanhood, and it's like a little protest on that Louisa is doing, and that she's doing the most she could do. So, like I said, she lived. She never got married. She was born on her dad's birthday. She was born on Bronson Alcott's birthday, and after her mom died, she and her dad lived together all throughout until they died 2 days apart. Because, like I said, she was never well. She died pretty young for she was like in middle age when she died. And he was an older man, and so they died 2 days apart. So she came in on his birthday, and they died really close together. So they were, their lives were linked. But she left behind this major legacy. So last thing, Little Women is actually part of a trilogy. I won't go into all this, but it was followed up with a sequel called Little Men, which I actually like better. It's the whole story of the school. So Little Women ends with her and Professor Bear planning to open a school in Plumfield where Aunt March used to live. Little Men is all about that school and all about how it goes. And a lot of Bronson Alcott's techniques and theories on education are depicted in scenes from this school. Like the students, they open a museum on the property in the barn, and they all can contribute exhibits to it. She gives each student a plot of the yard, and they can grow whatever they want in it. And some choose vegetables, some choose flowers. One of the students has a mental disability, and there's scenes talking about how they incorporate him into the curriculum and how they meet him at his level and make sure that he still has an experience and can learn. This is an excellent book if you're planning on being an educator. It's the story of the school that Joe and Friedrich Bear open. And then the third book is Joe's Boys, which is all of the students in her school. When they grow up, they become more like high school, early college age. And this is sort of following them as they're a little bit older, and the school sort of expands its offerings to teach older students as well. And so Joe's Boys, I would say Joe's Boys is the sequel to Little Men. They kind of go together. And they both together are kind of a follow-up to Little Women. So it is like a trilogy of all the same characters throughout, like Amy and Laurie and Meg and all. Beth, the third sister, dies in Little Women. She had scarlet fever, and it weakened her heart, and she ended up dying. That happened to Lizzie, as well. That was a real thing from their autobiography. So Beth isn't in Little Men and Joe's Boys, but the rest of the characters are, and their children are too. So okay, well, I'm back. I hope you found that interesting, and I hope that there was some new things about Louisa May Alcott that you didn't know before, and some things that might help you with your reading response or knowing what to say, maybe in the discussion board. And then when we meet in class, we can talk about some specific passages from the book that were interesting to you, and scenes that specifically relate to growing up and coming of age, and we can do more specifics in person. But I wanted you to have that background about the Alcotts, and they're just the whole interesting thing they had going on in the whole family. And so you can have the background about a lot of the biographical details that went into writing the book. Okay, I guess that's all for today. If you have any questions, you know how to find me. Otherwise, I will see you later. Bye.